York.
315 and 314 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're cleared hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Welcome back to Tactical Tangents. This is Jim. I'm here with Mike. This episode is brought to you in part by Drip Drop Oral Rehydration Solution. Drip Drop was meticulously formulated for fast absorption of water and salt without excess sugar. It doesn't totally replace IVs, but it's a lot easier than getting an IV. You can find it online or do a government purchase over GSA Advantage or through its national stock number, it's NSN. Yeah, you can find them on dripdrop.com. Mike, let's talk about the LA riots. The reason I want to bring this up, the LA riots, is it's a big reason why I'm a gun guy. It was when I was a kid living in the suburbs of LA, I remember seeing the LA riots, and I remember seeing looters and people messing with the cops and people pulling guys out of their cars in the middle of the street and beating the snot out of them. And I remember saying, why aren't the police stopping them? And not having a good answer. And to this day, I don't have a great answer to that. And I very distinctly remember the scenes of Asian, predominantly Korean liquor store owners and shop owners up on the rooftops with serious guns, keeping the rioters and the looters kind of at bay. And that mental image of, you know, we joke on the internet now about the roof Koreans or the rooftop Koreans.
It's legit.
They are a symbol of, you know, self-sufficiency and independence. And hey, if no one else is coming, we're it. And I think there's a lot to be said for that from a disaster preparedness standpoint and all that. And on top of that, as a gun guy, I'm a little bit worried about some of the stuff I'm hearing on the internet about how comfortable people seem to be with the idea of like kicking off a civil war. Now in 2020, the Boogaloo or whatever. Every time I hear that, I kind of cringe, and not just because it's dweeby, because it's really freaking dangerous. And I think it's time to talk about it. And I think it's time to talk about kind of the dynamics of mass unrest.
My motivation for this is similar because I think this is an important topic, and it captures a lot of other little nuanced things that I think we have to talk about. One of those things, and we're not going to like crack this nut today, and it's certainly not a deep dive, but one of those things has a little bit to do with the race stuff, like the racism thing, and that plays into it.
Like police are racist, right?
Yeah.
Like that's just a given.
Well, I mean, obviously that's true, yeah. Right? So there's that, and we'll get into that. And the other thing is, the most rioty thing that I have ever responded to in my career so far as a police officer was over a college basketball game. And in fact, in my town here, our college basketball game at various times over the years has been good. And we have had like some legit riots in town over college basketball games. Like there's a series of years that people can list off like, oh yeah, we had that in 97, 2001, so a series of them over a basketball game. So it's easy to go down this path of righteousness that this is about, racism, and it's about all the, tough economic times and all this stuff. But what happens when the civil unrest, and granted it might be a micro, smaller example of it, but when it's over a basketball game, it's not really about anything, right? Like, so there's some factors in there.
Public intoxication and
it plays into it.
Yeah.
So, and it's funny because with the basketball game thing, like people get really rowdy and excited when the team wins, and then they get upset and pissed off when the team loses. And so it could go either way. And it's not like, oh, maybe they'll win and everything will be fine. No, not necessarily.
No, you still might get your car set on fire, right? Yeah.
So there's some dynamics in there that I think we should understand, because this can happen in any town, right? And we maybe another episode in the future can have to do with riot control or crowd control in general, like more specific to the tactical side of it. I think tonight's focus is a little bit more strategic in nature, and it's about understanding the dynamics involved in the boiling point that becomes a riot.
Yes, and what I'm probably not going to get into is the group psychology and the social psychology aspect of it. It all ultimately is a human endeavor, and so ultimately there's always going to be psychology in it. But I'm not a subject matter expert in that. I don't think Mike is. But what I can tell you is it has a dynamic, and there is kind of a pattern to it, and we want to look for those patterns because riots are really freaking dangerous. And civil unrest, when it grows from kind of an unruly protest on one side of the spectrum to a riot to something more to a civil war, like that spectrum can get really nasty really fast, and you get things like genocide.
That's true. And so we're going to touch I'm not going to, like Jim said, we're not going to deep dive the psychology thing. I do want to touch on a couple concepts. It'll give you some things that maybe you can Google, and the Civil War thing, we'll kind of touch on that a little bit too, just to kind of just break the ice on it and give you some food for thought. But certainly we're not, this is just an introduction, if you will, to the bigger picture.
Yeah. So I want to kind of set the scene for you. In 1992, you have to understand the setting and the context. This was in Los Angeles. It was the early 90s. CNN was coming off this high of ratings and credibility and attention off the Gulf War, right? 1990, 1991 coverage. And it was looking for kind of the next big thing. And this kind of became their next big thing. And so the media started impacting the feedback loop, right? And started turning into a positive feedback loop of crowd energy. And on top of that, what it was magnifying and exacerbating and amplifying was ethnic tension that's already endemic in Los Angeles and any big city, really, and was peaking at this time, in particular between the Black and the Asian communities in and around South Central Los Angeles. South Central LA, the hood, if you will, right? So there were a number of things that kind of drove that tension, right? There's the kind of the constant tension, like I said, in any big city, in particular LA, and particularly at that time, but there were also some events that were kind of pushing it. One was before or in the background of the Rodney King stuff, which we're going to get into, of course. There was a young Black woman, Latasha Harlins, who was in a Korean-owned liquor store. She appeared to be shoplifting. She got into a tussle with the clerk. She started walking away. The clerk shot her in the back of the head. The clerk was convicted, but sentenced only to probation for her homicide. That was in a lot of ways as maddening to the community as the Rodney King beating. The Rodney King beating was March 3rd, 1991. So prior to the riots, right, by like a year. Rodney King was this dude who was on parole for robbery, and he had priors for assault, battery, robbery, a couple other things. He led California Highway Patrol on a high-speed chase on the 210 freeway. That's my hometown freeway. Once stopped, he and the other occupants were cuffed and kind of carried off. King was the last one to exit his car. He seemed agitated, and the arresting officers described it like as though he were on PCP or something like that. In their efforts to get him subdued and cuffed, at some point he was tasered at least once, maybe twice, and he was batoned by 4 or 5, I think it was 5 LAPD officers, struck about 56 times. We know that because it was captured on tape. And the tape was a big deal.
Yeah, and if you think back to the early 1991. This is before body cameras. This is before social media. And so you had a lot of these accusations and tension between the police and some of these communities, but it wasn't often that this sort of thing was captured on tape. So the fact that someone was able to come forward to the media with video footage and say, hey, look at what I saw, and they could put this on blast, across all these major media outlets was huge. And it was not like today you would expect that to be true. Back then, not so much.
And in fact, you could make a claim that tape was one of the first truly organically viral tapes or recordings, in modern history, where it really took off and people really started looking at it over and over and over. And what that tape did was confirmed a lot of the things that kind of the poor and the downtrodden and the minorities in Los Angeles had been claiming about law enforcement for years, that they're getting screwed with.
And more importantly, Jim, validated the emotions behind those things.
Yep.
They could say, see, I told you so.
Yep. So activists for civil rights from across the country saw this as a rallying cry and a focal point for their attention. And this was being used to fight for more regulation of law enforcement, more investment in minority communities, some political campaigns and fundraising. And it's important here to distinguish between activists and agitators, and also between protesters and rioters. And we're not quite to the riot yet, but start thinking about that in the context like there's a legit civil rights issue here, and there's a legit group of people around the country who are activists who are trying to fight for reforms, and they create energy, and sometimes that energy can do great things, can do wonderful fixes to the structure of law enforcement or structure of our laws, or just bring awareness and attention to a problem. And sometimes that energy can get focused or hijacked into something ugly.
I think it's also important to point out that when we think about how long ago 1991 was, it's 2020. That was 30 years ago. And I was a kid, 1991, 1992, I can't say that I can, really remember like a good feel for every little thing that was going on in society at, 6, 7 years old. But I do have memories of 1991. And as I grew up, I remember back to those times, and especially as we moved into the era where computers and cell phones and pagers and those sorts of things, like thinking back, I remember 91, 92 well enough that it wasn't that long ago. And now I can say that, man, that was 30 years ago.
I'm old.
Yeah. Put into context, though, that in 1991, 1992, what was 30 years ago like to people then? People our age remember 30 years ago when civil rights was like, I'm not saying it's not a big deal now, and I'm not saying it wasn't a big deal in 1991, but in the early mid 60s, that was like the peak of the civil rights movement, right? Yep. And not just for racial stuff, but also for gender stuff. And so we're talking, it wasn't that long ago in that context for a lot of those people that were affected by this.
Yep. So that's a good point. That video got played over and over and over. And again, thinking back to CNN and kind of how CNN operated and how it was the precursor to all the other cable news that we know, Fox News and MSNBC and stuff. They were playing that same clip over and over and over, darn near 24/7 for a little bit. And it got a lot of attention. And they were filming live throughout the trial. And so the trial became one of the first really big media circus trials of LA. And so people were watching. I remember watching it every day. I'd come home from school and I'd watch the trial because I was a nerd and that's what I was into. And then the verdict got read. So it's important to work you through the sequence of events of what happened with this riot and stuff. And I'm going to bounce back and forth between the actual sequence and kind of how I remember it. Because again, I was watching it every day after school. I'd, come home and watch it. And that's what we talked about in school and stuff was what was going on with the trial and whether we thought they were guilty or not, because anyone cares what a 6th grader, 7th grader, or whatever thinks.
And for that reason, the timeline really, really matters, right? Like the timeline is important here because we're talking about this buildup of tension.
And it was months.
And it's building and it's building and it's getting more attention and all this anticipation, and people are getting anxious about what's going to happen, and it reaches this boiling point. So it seems kind of gradual, and then once it boils over, it just spills over the top, and it's a big mess.
Yep. So ultimately, the verdict got read, and the whole trial took place in Simi Valley, which is north of LA, pretty substantially north. And they set the trial up in Simi Valley on purpose, right? Change of venue. And protests started basically immediately. And in fact, there were protests the whole time while the trial was happening. There were some protests, but the protests got really darn intense the day of the verdict. And the riots started the day of the verdict, shortly after, in sequence, after the mayor of LA held a press conference. And it was a very expressive press conference. He was talking about how angry he was. And some argue the mayor's comments were kind of taken as a signal to riot, or taken as permission by people to riot. I don't know. That's plausible.
It's up for interpretation, though.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Notably, the riots started in South Central. And that's not where King was. That's not where the trial was, and it's not where the cops were. It was where it's where a lot of the bad guys were, for lack of a better way of saying it, which is not to say that everyone in South Central are the bad guys, obviously. But that's where the gangbangers were. Might be the best way of putting it. So, on day one, the actual rioting started in little clusters, little pockets. The little clusters of otherwise criminal behavior along Normandy Avenue. And it started as little, like, strong-arm robberies. It was just general lawlessness, not unlike any typical day in South Central LA. Strong-arm robberies of liquor stores. When the cops would show up, they would kind of surround the cops who were trying to arrest the liquor store robber. And then you get these standoffs, and the cops would kind of back off because they could see, things were escalating. And these pockets started growing. And by early evening, at one particular intersection, the intersection of Florence and Normandy, delivery trucks crossing that intersection were effectively getting ambushed by rioters. It's noteworthy here that LAPD effectively didn't have any eyes up or out. And newscasters were providing kind of de facto surveillance, aerial surveillance. So into the evening, 3 truck drivers, there was a guy named Larry Tarvin, a guy named Reginald Denny, who's kind of the famous one, and a guy named Fidel Lopez, were pulled out of their trucks and beaten nearly to death by rioters. And they were ultimately rescued, but it's important to note, they weren't rescued by the cops. They were rescued by black private citizens. And, well, the intersection ambushes were happening in South Central. The protests at the main LAPD station were growing and kind of heating up, and by 9 p.m., they were full-blown riots. The difference is LAPD actually intervened to protect their own station.
At that point, it's kind of more about them than everybody else, which, to me, philosophically kind of goes against what I think the role of law enforcement should be, which is also to protect people, not just themselves. But this is an important, we have to examine this, because as we go down this path of why these riots started and this boiling point that we're talking about, you have to see that there's a lot of infighting amongst the communities themselves. So that's going to come up later, but it's just something to think about in the context of the police aren't coming to help you, and these people are, you have people in the street now attacking each other.
Yep. And by 9 p.m., those were full-blown riots, right? And LAPD was intervening, but they were mostly just protecting their own assets, and notably not the businesses in South Central. It was also noteworthy that several firefighters on scene at the main LAPD station reported getting shot at. And that's one of the first instances I can think of where firefighters were targeted or felt targeted. Overnight on night one, the looting spread. It spread up and out from South Central, up in Inglewood, into Hollywood, into Hawthorne, Compton, and into Long Beach. So you can kind of see those pockets grow, right? I mean, you use the expression like it went viral or something like that. That's true. Now, in parallel to all that, you have to understand what the cops were doing, right? I mentioned a little bit like kind of what they were doing around the main LAPD building. The best way to describe the law enforcement response through all of day one was it was kind of lethargic. And it's easy to critique it in hindsight, and I'm not here just to talk smack about LAPD. I mean, they have an incredibly hard job that they do incredibly well 99% of the time, right? But it's pretty clear here that there were indicators all along the trial, and as they were approaching the verdict, that this was going to get at least serious protests, right? LAPD had warning that the verdict was coming, both strategic warning and tactical warning. And they knew it enough that they stood up an emergency operations center. So they stood up, the facility, but they didn't put anyone in it.
Yeah, I was going to say, and what did they do with that, Jim?
Yeah, they I guess went and got coffee. I'm not really sure, but there was no one there. There was like 3 telephones and a fax machine set up. So even once the unrest started growing, the forward staging site, which was a bus station, it didn't have TVs, so they couldn't see what was going on. They had some phone lines, but it was like 3. And they didn't have any manning. Law enforcement that was out in the field was outnumbered, and they were told more or less to observe and wait it out. And I distinctly remember that. I remember very vividly seeing cops just standing there, watching the riot happen. And LAPD, as an agency, didn't issue a citywide tactical alert until just before sundown on day one, which was about 5 hours into this. People were watching it live, and they were seeing that there was no one actively countering the unrest. And one of the big phrases was like, "There's no police presence here. They will not enter the area." And that's where the inertia really got going, was when people saw that and were like, well, no one's going to stop me, so I'm going to go get a TV from the store down the street, right?
I mean,
yeah,
I can't say I wouldn't.
Yeah, that's how I got my TV. So,
I mean, no, it's not.
Yeah. So it's important to watch how you have several flare-ups all happening at the same time, and parallel attack is tough for bureaucracies to cope with. And that was one of the tricky parts here, was there were several protests happening all over the city, and I think that had a paralyzing effect on it. Another thing that might have played a part was 2/3 of Los Angeles Police Department senior leaders were not in the city when this started. They were in Ventura.
Got things to do.
They had things to do. They had an in-service training event in Ventura that day.
Convenient.
Conveniently, the chief of police on night one, he was at a political fundraiser in Brentwood. Not
nice part of town. That's cool.
Not where I would have been in the middle of a riot, or maybe it is where I would be in the middle of a riot. I don't know. So a bunch of things happened in the response, in night one. As the night progressed, it became very obvious that things were getting ugly, right? Especially as the footage of those guys getting pulled out of their trucks and beaten came out. That was one of the real,
visceral, emotional
focal points of this event, right? On night one. On night one, the California National Guard got activated by the governor, and they were told to make an immediate full deployment. And it's funny, the National Guard talks about that, their ability to be Minutemen, but they very rarely nationwide have to really do it for real. It doesn't happen very often, like 9/11, maybe LA riots, and not much else. So they get the phone call like, hey, send everybody right now. Things are getting ugly.
The Boogaloo.
the Boogaloo started. Get out there, right? And so the problem is there's some real logistical challenges. The state of California, just by virtue of its shape, a lot of National Guard guys are up in Northern California. Well, if especially if
that's
you're
like
not
a 9-hour drive.
Yeah, especially if you're not from California, you may not understand. That's not close. So some of these guys were staged 300 miles away, 400 miles away, and where they didn't necessarily have ammo, and they didn't necessarily what are they going to do? Drive their Humvees down from Eureka? No, there's logistics involved in moving military assets around or National Guard assets around, right? You need airlift. So some of them got bussed in, some of them got flown in. They met, among other things, at the LA Police Academy and were giving commercial ammo. And once, over the course of the day-ish that it took them to show up, they had to sort out where they were going to go and what their authorities were and weren't. So there's a inherent delay anytime you bring in a big agency or an outside force like the National Guard, right? Also on night one, a group of several hundred protesters gathered at the original arrest site of Rodney King. And that got progressively more violent, but that was met by counter-riot tactics, like actual traditional counter-riot tactics by LAPD. I don't know why they choose to make their stand there, but they did.
If I had to guess, and this is simply this is a hypothesis. I have nothing to go off of here,
Yeah.
but if I had to guess in the context of just trying to get themselves organized, that was one spot where they actually had everyone in some sort of position where they can deploy out to that location and say, hey, we can actually respond to this in some organized way. It's probably about it. They probably thought that was going to be a focal point and they wanted to put that fire out.
Yeah. So into day two, the riot kind of shifted, and the focus of the riot shifted toward Koreatown. And remember when I told you about Latasha Harlins and her story and how her killer was, whether justified or not, was given probation for shooting her in the back of the head. So there was a lot of anger toward the Asian American community in Koreatown, and there are a couple factors that drove that, right? There was anger over Latasha. There was proximity, the fact that Koreatown happens to be very close to the rest of South Central LA. And also, on day two, you started to see blocking actions by the police to try to box in this riot, right? To contain it. And so they kind of contained it into Koreatown. And the narrative of some of the people who were there in Koreatown was they got cut off and left to fend for themselves. And I don't know how true that is, but that is certainly how they felt. And if you look back to the footage of it, you can see that. You can see Korean shop owners literally making a stand, like the Alamo kind of stand on their rooftops.
Rooftop Koreans.
Rooftop Koreans. God bless America. And so they held, and the riots continued for about another day and a half from there. And over the course of 2.5 days, 63 people died. Just under $1 billion of damage to businesses occurred. About 3,600 fires got set. About 1,100 buildings were destroyed. Oh, and from just one of the gun stores that got robbed, 1,100 guns were stolen. So, when you think about how gun control works in California, and I don't want to get too political here, but gosh, well, doesn't matter how good your control is. Yeah, here's the thing. They just armed up half of LA right there. So,
and probably not your
probably not the people you want
brightest.
Armed. Yeah, probably not your safety instructors and stuff. So that's the LA riots in a nutshell. And I'm trying not to, give you the whole LA riot story because you can find that elsewhere. You can go on YouTube and stuff. I want you just to kind of be refreshed on what happened and how it happened and how ugly it got.
And the timeline, right? Like we mentioned a bit ago, the boiling point that you have to reach before it is now out of your control.
Yeah.
Like there was a point in time where they might have been able to
break the chain.
some of this. And I use the term curb to help understand, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have actual control over it, but you might be able to kind of stymie the flow a little bit and get ahead of it. I mean, you can't control, or you can't really dictate or predict the reactions of a crowd. Like, this could have been something that completely boiled over into nothing. Like if you bombed a leader of Iran or something.
Yeah.
But so you can only do so much to predict what's going to happen next, but the boiling point is important. So the timeline and the buildup and all the emotions and all the frustrations and all the things that kind of contribute to that boiling point are kind of those warning signs that you have to pay attention to. So I think the timeline matters.
And something I kind of missed was how the riots really ended. My perception is they just kind of fizzled. Frankly, after about 2.5 days, people
got tired.
They got physically tired. It takes a lot of energy to destroy stuff. I talked about that in the disaster episode. Like, there's an energy factor to destruction. And the hangover starts setting in. The literal hangover in some cases starts setting in. The law enforcement reaction gets more organized and more robust. The National Guard starts really rolling in, and they actually get their ammo. they know where to stand, and they've got their radio stuff sorted out. But if it takes 2.5 days to get a real response, like, that's too long.
Well, and how long exactly? Well, like you said, how many, $1 billion in damage, bunch of buildings, 63 people killed.
Yep.
Bunch of fires, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep. So that's kind of the synopsis of the LA riots. And I really just want you to think about that dynamic and how it got going, and how you saw genuine anger and genuine protest, and you also saw a-hole criminals interspersed with that, right? Interleaved with it. And taking advantage of it, and taking advantage of the paralysis of law enforcement to commit criminal acts. And then you see that kind of feed off of itself. One of my favorite terms is positive feedback loop. Feedback to most people is like, the professional feedback that you get at work. You did a good job, you did a bad job, whatever. Feedback in a science sense or a math sense is
getting a reaction. The
tendency of a thing to feed off of itself, right? So like population growth is a positive feedback loop. And, the population grows, and then that grown population all reproduces, and then it grows, and it grows bigger and bigger and bigger, and grows logarithmically or exponentially, whatever, right? And then propagates or auto-catalyzes, if you want to get all SAT scoring. And then a negative feedback loop is a thing that tends to get smaller on its own, right? Whereas a positive feedback loop tends to get bigger on its own. So at some point you hit this critical threshold, or critical mass, if you will, right, of rage and lawlessness, where it's really hard to, like Mike said, curb it back in, under control. So we want to understand the triggers of that and how it gets to that critical mass. And it's not just ethnic tension, and it's not just criminal elements. It's like the combination of them. And particularly when there's organization or facilitation from outside, it's that intersection, right, of anger, genuine anger in the community, and a real and separate, in most cases, criminal element that's trying to take advantage of that. And activists, again, for civil rights from across the country saw this as a rallying cry and a focal point for their attention. And they were trying to use it to fight for more regulation and more investment and political campaigning. But then you had agitators who were just trying to pick a fight, right? And you have protesters who are trying to express genuine anger, and you also have rioters who are trying to get a new TV. And there's a dichotomy there, and you have to understand what you're looking at when this unrest comes to your neighborhood.
Jim, and I want to talk about the activist thing, because if you're an activist for any given cause, then you are in a sense looking for, and excuse is not the right word, but like you're looking for a vehicle, right? Like you're looking for
an
something that you can use.
An opportunity.
Yeah, you're looking for something that you can use to like carry or sell or deliver your message. And so if you are a civil rights activist, which, you know, a legitimate thing in the 90s, a legitimate thing today, right? It's a legitimate thing. And this occurs. Now you're saying like, look, this is what I'm talking about. So there's a couple things that I think we have to explore when we talk about civil unrest in general, and when we talk about the society issues that were going on at the time. One of those things is there was a sociologist in the aftermath of the LA riots that described it, and he said this wasn't a race riot, it was a class riot. And so he made some points about the difference between, was this about racial tension, or did it have more to do with the rich versus the poor versus the middle class, or something like that? And I don't know what the answer to that question is. LA is a very big city, and it's got a lot of...
it's diverse.
A lot. Yeah, it's very diverse in like the truest sense of that word. There's so many pockets of, I mean, you've got the richest of the rich, like maybe literally, and then you've got the poorest of the poor in many cases, and people from all over the world, different cultures and backgrounds and everything. So something that I think that's important to explore a little bit is what's called stereotype threat. And that's actually a term. Like you can Google stereotype threat. It's not just like I didn't just make that up. And the concept is kind of difficult to wrap my head around because it's difficult to talk about. Like the last thing that I want to do is sit there and like blame the poor people or blame like the black people and say that they're perpetuating their own problems, because that's not the point.
And it's not helpful.
It's certainly not helpful, but I also don't want to come across that way because I don't feel that way.
Yeah.
But if you understand the like, and I don't think it's a psychology thing so much as a sociology thing or whatever, but the concept of stereotype threat has to do with essentially believing that in certain situations you are more or less at risk for certain stereotypes. So if you are a girl, for example, and you think that just because you're a girl, you're not going to be good at certain sports, you are self-limiting in the idea that you are not good at sports because of the perception that girls are not good at sports. Does that make sense? So it's not that that's actually true, and it's not that you couldn't overcome that. It's just that if you are affected by your own belief in that stereotype because of just what you've heard, that you can that it can play into that, right? So the same thing could be if you think that you're just getting pulled over because you're black. Like, oh, you just pulled me over. You just stopped me because I'm black. So the thing about those stereotypes that play into this isn't that those stereotypes don't exist. Those are external things, right? Like that is a factor, of course. So they are real. They do exist. But the concept is important to understand because to some extent people might perpetuate those things in their own subtle ways or whatever. And in the context that one study that I read about stereotype threat, it had to do with SAT scores and someone's own belief about how well or how smart or intelligent that they were. So it really had little to do with race and little to do with gender or anything like that. It had to do with education and those sorts of things. But those stereotypes can weigh in other ways. So consider that if you are 10 or 11, 12 years old, and your parents, who, by the way, grew up in the 50s or 60s, right? Like where these stereotypes were like, and I'm not saying they weren't present in the 90s, and I'm not saying they're not present today, but like in the 50s and 60s, if those are your parents and you were raised to believe that the world turns a certain way, right? Just the way that you might have grown up and you were taught to believe in God, or you believe in Santa Claus or whatever.
Your paradigm, like, your way of looking at the world, right?
Right. Like that is something that you are conditioned to do. Those parents had an especially good reason to feel that way. And so if you are raised in that environment, it's no surprise that you might also feel that way. So again, it's not to say that those things don't really exist, but it's a factor to consider if you are so certain that racism isn't a thing. even if we argued that it isn't, you can still at least factor in that, well, they were probably raised to believe that. And that's not really their fault, right? Their parents, who did really believe that, raised them a certain way, and that affected their perception of the world. And now, in this interaction, you have an opportunity to maybe fight against that, right? So, like, if you're like a cop and you're listening to this and you're thinking about, oh, people just think I stopped them because they're black, like, consider that. Consider that maybe they were raised a certain way and you're fighting an uphill battle, and it's not their fault, but it's also not your fault.
And on top of that, they have real life experiences where they feel like they've been targeted, and maybe they really have been targeted. And you may not, feel racist in your heart, but, there are subtle biases, and the last cop they dealt with might not have had subtle biases, might have had real biases.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, absolutely. Which brings up another good point, and that's that if we just use the context of law enforcement or just the criminal justice system, because everyone likes to make this point about, oh, criminal justice system, it's predominantly, black males of this age range or whatever. Okay, yeah, I mean, that's true, I'm sure, or whatever, but like, more importantly, is that a law enforcement or criminal justice thing, or is that a societal thing? And law enforcement and criminal justice is a sample of a greater societal problem. And that's something to consider too. I remember my uncle, who retired from Orange County Sheriff's Department in Southern California, a more wealthy part of Southern California, close to the beach and all these things, right? He would tell me when I was growing up about these times that people would call because there's a black guy in their neighborhood. And he would tell me how wrong that was. He's like, yeah, I can't believe these people are so racist. They just think some black guy's in the neighborhood and he's there for like a, perfectly legitimate reason. And these people would call and report it. And like, of course he's got to like answer the call in some form or way, but that's a society thing. That's not a law enforcement thing, right? Yep. So he thought that was wrong. Many people might not believe that, but it's another angle on it. Yeah. And then the other thing I want to talk about, and it's kind of twofold, but groupthink. So in the same way that if a fire breaks out in a building, if you're at school or at a mall or whatever, and there's a fire and someone starts moving towards the door or someone decides to shelter in place, there is a tendency for people to follow that lead, right? Yes. And this happens in any number of contexts. And in the context of a riot, for example, once you start seeing other people do this sort of thing and those group or societal norms break down or a new norm is established, we are all more likely to fall in line with that. Yep. And you'll see this in your workplace. You'll see it in, like I said, you go to a store or a mall. Think about like, if you go to a retail store or something and like it's not clear to you where the line forms, like it's not a natural, like they don't have like a ribbon up that shows like the line forms here. Like, well, people will just kind of create their own, right? And they start to kind of just work off of each other. It's the same sort of thing. And I mentioned that this was a twofold problem because context matters. And there was an experiment that they did back in the day. If you Google the Stanford Prison Experiment, you'll read about this thing that they did where they took a group of people and at random, they selected some to act as prisoners or inmates and some to act as prison guards. And, it was a controversial experiment, like what the purpose and meaning of it was. You can, read up on it. We'll put a link, like a wiki link or something, but what it boiled down to, what the outcome of the study or the experiment essentially taught us, which the experiment was cut short. It was stopped early because things got out of hand. But what it taught us was that in context, the prison guards acted like, power-hungry prison guards, and the prisoners acted like prisoners, whether that meant that they were disobedient to the man or it meant that they fell in line and were subservient in some way, right? And why those people behaved those certain ways was all about the context of the situation they were placed in, whether they were assigned as a guard, whether they were assigned as a prisoner, not because of any inherent personality traits necessarily, right? So in the context here, that all plays into the way that you behave. And I think those factors are important to consider when you think about, how groups behave in the context of civil unrest.
Those are great points. I think also, more broadly, taking a social psychology class is probably one of the best things you can do for yourself. If you're looking real seriously into law enforcement, military, leadership in general, social psych gives you a good opportunity to learn about things like the Stanford Prison Study, the Milgram experiment, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So, absolutely. Now, Mike was talking about how Los Angeles handles diversity and the tension there. And one of the ways we as a country hold ourselves together despite our diversity and despite our tension is the genuine belief in a concept called rule of law. And this term gets abused a lot. You hear it in politics a lot, often wrong. For our purposes today, I'm going to give you a definition of rule of law. And for our academic context, talking about riots and stuff, I'll tell you that I define it as the belief in the credible and equal application of the law to all people, regardless of race, creed, station, or position. Effectively, no one is above the law. Not white people, not cops, not Korean liquor store owners, not violent gangs, not presidents. That the law, under the Constitution, is the king. And that there is no earthly king otherwise, right? It also means we allow the government to hold a legitimate monopoly on violence. And that confuses people too. But that's basic poli-sci 101 is what makes a government, what makes a nation state is...
Yeah, I was to say the definition of a state.
Is a legitimate monopoly on violence. And that includes violence on your own citizens. So in other words, if someone breaks into my car, I don't get to be the judge, jury, and executioner and stomp that guy's teeth into the curb like American History X. It means I call the cops, and I let the cops and the courts sort it out. That's rule of law. And that the courts will handle that person, that perpetrator, basically the same way, whether that guy is a federal judge, or white, or black, or Hispanic, or very young, or very old, or very rich, or very poor, or whatever. Like, that person's going to be treated fundamentally the same way. And rule of law also includes some level of respect for the law by everybody involved. And when I say respect, sometimes I mean a little bit of fear, which in practical terms means that criminals believe they stand a good chance of being caught and punished for criminal acts.
Deterrence is the fear of arrest. Yep. That is criminal deterrence, right?
Exactly. So there's a lot of economics in law and a lot of risk and reward assessment done by criminals. Bad guys will do anything they think they can get away with. And when they see 1,000 people walking out of a Walmart with flat screen TVs and no one's stopping them, just like Mike said, that group think,
I'm going to get mine.
They're going to get theirs, right? So in the context of the LA riots, and this is where I think it's really important to break out of your own paradigm about how that went. When most people think of the breakdown of rule of law during the LA riots, they picture the riots themselves and the rioters and the guys looting the shops. And they picture the cops standing by and watching. And that was a breakdown in rule of law, but that was only part of it. You have to understand that to a lot of the minorities and the inner city people, the rioters believed, right or wrong, that they're held to a different standard than the whites and the police or the wealthy people, and that in itself was a breakdown in the rule of law. The rioters would tell you the actual breakdown in rule of law was at the Harlins and Rodney King verdicts, where it appeared they couldn't rely on the government to apply justice equally, right? The cops are going to get away with it. Why can't I get away with it? And so it was the breakdown in the belief in the institution of law.
So it's a loss of structure. We have lost the structure of order in our government or our society.
And the belief that structure will work in your interest.
Yep.
Right.
And I have a couple thoughts on rule of law. One of the fortunate opportunities that I have at work is the opportunity to teach every police recruit that comes to our academy. There's a class that I teach on day one. And so it's cool that I get in front of them that early. And I try not to let that be wasted. And there's a quote by Fisher Ames, who was among other things, a congressman back in the day, that goes, "Liberty cannot be enjoyed. Indeed, it cannot exist without the habits of just subordination. It consists not so much in removing all restraint from the orderly as imposing it on the violent." Now, Ames was a Federalist back in the day, so he felt the federal government should be strong, right? That democracy involved or necessitated a sense of balance between not giving too much power to the people to just run amok, that you needed a strong form of...
If you're going to run amok, run amok.
So as far as I can tell, he felt that this thing that we call democracy required this balance to keep government strong and that to keep a government strong and orderly, but also protect the rights and the liberty of its people. And you could couple this with the idea that Jim talked about, that the definition of a state or a government, right, involved the monopoly of use of force on its people. And so for our purposes, and this is, again, me talking to cops when they're brand new, right? For our purposes, it means that as representatives of government, our goal is not to limit or restrict the freedom of the good people in our society, but to impose restraint on the troublemakers. So when I talk to cops about decision-making and use of force, I remind them that as police officers, we are often the most adversarial members of government that people will ever interact with, right? You are, in many cases, the seeming bad guy, right? Like, you're the people that everyone is afraid of, in a sense. And because of that, you have to be the balance, right? You are the balance between tyranny and anarchy. And with that power comes great responsibility, because it wasn't all that long ago that the people of this nation, of this country, of this land, decided to overthrow their government and to do their own thing. That was not that long ago. When we talk about, just in this conversation, we talked about 30 years, and then we rewound another 30 years, and getting to 200 at 30 years at a time, a generation at a time, that's not that hard to do, right? So it wasn't that long ago that the people of this nation overthrew their government and started their own program. So it's important to remember that and to understand that before we get hot-headed, before we lose our temper, before we let our ego interfere with our judgment, that we are the balance and that we help define that line. And for everyone's sake, it's imperative that we get that right. Upholding the rule of law is something that any individual police officer can screw up for an entire city, for an entire community, for the country. And this is a good example of that.
That was nicely put. And to put this in a military context, I want you to understand the idea of the strategic corporal, which I stole from the Marines, and I'm pretty sure it was General Krulak. Don't crucify me if I mess that up, but I'm pretty sure that's who popularized it. The idea is that even a corporal in the Marine Corps has the potential to have a strategic impact, both good and bad, right? That if you get seen on CNN, abusing POWs at Abu Ghraib prison, that could have a strategic impact. And those were Army guys, just to be clear, but work with me. Could have a strategic impact on the whole war, especially when it comes to public perception. And I'm going to broaden this out. There's a guy named Clausewitz back in the day who was a general military strategist, one of the famous ones, like a Sun Tzu type guy. And he talked about the fact that there are this triad of the people, the state, and the army in any fight. And in a democracy, especially, the relationship between the people and the state and the army is a big deal. And when states fight each other, it's not just army versus army. It's an extension of politics by other means, and it's the people and the state and the army and how they all interact as a dynamic. So you, Corporal Bob or Lieutenant Bob or Officer Bob or whatever, need to understand that you could have a disproportionate impact on the whole strategic front. And you don't want to be the guy who sets off the riot because you decided to whip out your baton or your taser when you didn't need to. When you engage your weapons before you engage your brain, you got a problem. And I think it's worthwhile for anyone to go back and look at the video of the Rodney King beating. And, you can really love cops and still say like, ooh,
WTF over.
Maybe we shouldn't have done that. Right. And, and the nature of law enforcement is there are cop lovers and cop haters. And please get past that. We love good cops. We love good decision making. And we don't like bad cops. And we don't like bad decision making. And you can be a good cop and make a bad decision, and we can forgive you and move on with our lives. But like, that doesn't help the guy who just got beaten to the pavement. Right.
Yeah. And you also look at events like that and you go, man, could you imagine today what would happen? Like,
yep,
you're going to prison, dude. Like you're SOL.
Yeah, and the question you have to ask, and we don't know because the cops didn't have cameras back in the day. How normal was that? How many times a week did they do that? How many times a year did they do that? Was that just that one time where you had the magical combination of personalities and the group think, or was that like
adrenaline?
An adrenaline, or was that like shouldn't have sped on the 210 freeway on a Tuesday because that's what we do to you, right? So think about that. We're going to shift gears a little bit and think more broadly about unrest and breakdown and rule of law. And, when I say rule of law, it's also kind of tongue in cheek because a lot of survival nut and prepper types talk about this. They talk about what if there's a breakdown in rule of law. There's shorthand in the prepper community, the WROL event, which they mean, a civil war, insurrection, or usurpation of government. That's a valid concern in a disaster preparation context. I mean, can you say for certain there will never be another civil war? I can't. And by the way, we've already had one. Big one, right? The U.S. Civil War, and before that, we had the Revolutionary War, which effectively was a civil war itself, right? So, every 150 years, something like that, you get one. So, getting into that, getting into civil unrest in general, I want you to think about activists versus agitators. It's important in this discussion to understand the difference between protests and riots and between activists and agitators. I brought that up earlier. Free speech, free assembly, free protest, those things are part of our national identity. They're part of the core of what makes us a free country. So at what point does a protest, which is totally legit, become a riot, which is totally scary and dangerous and criminal? Well, the analogy I use is your right to swing your fists ends at my nose, right? So your rights end at screwing up my rights. Similarly, political movement leaders, activists, are out there harnessing and guiding popular sentiment to achieve policy change. That's totally legit. Activism is a good and healthy thing. In this context, agitators are the people out there trying to whip the protest into a riot. And what you need to know about agitators is they are not your friend. And they're not even necessarily sympathetic to your cause. They could be actors of a foreign government. And you wouldn't necessarily know that.
I want to bring up the Fisher Ames quote again that I mentioned earlier. Yeah. There was another quote that he said that was, "Those who cannot be ruled by reason resolved that they would not be restrained by power."
Ooh.
those who could not be ruled by reason resolved that they would not be restrained by power. And and I'm not here to talk about like the politics or the philosophical beliefs of the guy, but understanding that what he was sort of pushing against was this purest form of democracy, right? Like this purest form of democracy that the people have all the say. And he was kind of like more like the republic thing where, well, the people should pick the people that they want to make the decisions for them. And if we give the people too much say, then they're going to, that they're probably not prepared to make some of those decisions themselves, essentially.
Oh, this just got really political and philosophical. Ooh, I like it.
Well, and the reason that I bring this up, though, is because in the context of activist versus agitator, part of his point was that, like, people will do whatever is convenient for them, in a sense. Like, if they think that, like, oh, I could use, like, this reason to go get a new TV, right? Like, that's why, like, in a lot of sense, like, some people, okay, well, that's not, are we, I mean, and I joke about it, but, like, think about, like, some of these people vote, kids, like, think about that,
Yep.
right? So, we deal with people every day that, like, reason doesn't get through to them, right? Like, I pull somebody over for, like, a totally legitimate traffic violation, right? Like, back before, like, medical marijuana and all that, like, oh, well, I smell weed, so I search his car and I find weed, oh, and a gun and, like, a dead body or whatever, and he's throwing a fit, like, and I can't reason with that guy about why I searched his car or pulled him over in the first place. It's like trying to argue with a sovereign citizen. It's like, that's not going anywhere, right? But
it's a little literary foreshadowing there.
What's that?
It's a little literary foreshadowing there.
Right. And so, like, where I'm going with that in terms of, like, what people's rights are and what, what activism is there's a degree that, like, you can't, like, reason only takes you so far when you tie in emotion, right? And once you start tying emotion to it and people just get pissed off for the sake of getting pissed off, they will rationalize that any way that they can in a lot of cases. So people will agitate these things into a bigger deal than it really is because of that emotional problem. And you can't necessarily reason with that is where I'm going.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about how to best piggyback on that, because it's a good point. And I'm thinking back to just trying to define a riot. What makes a protest and a riot different, right? Protest is speech and, people getting together and assembling and redressing their grievances. And a riot's when they start setting fire to things and breaking things and hurting people, right, and also blocking right of way. Again, your rights end at my rights, right?
Well, and like activism versus agitator, right? Like activism, like you have this. What I would like to think for most activists is, like, there is a reasonable or rational argument that these people are rallying for. Mm-hmm. And I think, like you said, that's totally legit. That's good. And then there's agitators, right?
Yep.
Where
they're
now
just trying
they're
to
just
start shit.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's important, because you have to start to factor in, where does the reason fall into play?
As an interesting path to get there. I like it. It's an interesting path.
Yeah. Thinking out loud here.
No, I like it. So getting into the agitators, and what I need you to understand about a riot is that it's tough to have widespread mayhem. It takes a lot of energy, like I said, and physical work in a lot of cases, to throw rocks, to set fires, to loot stores, to shoot at cops. That takes work. And like Mike said, someone's got to break the seal. Someone's got to give the crowd permission by taking that initial action to get past the social norm, to break the rules. But then once you have that marauding crowd, that's where that energy really starts building itself, and you get that positive feedback, and they start growing and growing, getting meaner and more violent. And they're effectively, at some point, an army on the move. And an army on the move has to be fed and watered and directed and sometimes even transported. And that takes organization. And And you didn't see that necessarily in the LA riots, but you see that in other settings. So I'm going somewhere with this. Bear with me, right? That takes a level of organization that usually requires professionals, and those people are often brought in from outside of the protest and outside of the riot. So what I want you to think about is, say I want to overthrow the government of Stolichnaya. Do I give a shit? Wow. Yeah, thank you. Do I give a shit that the taxi drivers in Stolichnaya are underpaid? Hell no. But my agitators on social media and out in face-to-face, they're going to be all riled up about it. They're going to be out there really trying to get the Stolichnaya freaking taxi drivers ticked off about how much they're getting paid.
So there's some emotion and passion that you can capitalize on.
And maybe there's some real passion and emotion. And maybe the Stolichnaya taxi drivers have been downtrodden and abused for years and years and years. Do I care about that if I'm trying to overthrow the government? No. I'm trying to do whatever my country is telling me to do.
Hypothetically.
But I'm going to make sure my agitators are out there, again, spinning those guys up and making sure they feel their rage. And I'm going to make sure they get that protest going. I'm going to make sure if they need money to get that protest going, they get it. If they need social media influence to get it going, I make sure they get it. I'm also going to make sure they have, bandanas to cover their faces in case, the tear gas shows up. I'm going to make sure they have some glass bottles of water in case it gets hot. I'm going to make sure they have some fuel oil in case it gets cold. And then, hey, if they put all those together and they make a Molotov cocktail, well, nature finds a way, right? And this is what I want you to understand about agitators, is they don't necessarily care about you. And whoever is goading you toward civil unrest on social media, whoever's trying to convince you that we don't actually have rule of law in this country, they don't have your best interest at heart.
Groupthink.
They're trying to get that groupthink going.
Yep.
And they're trying to get you to go die for your cause to accomplish their agenda.
So the fumes are already there. Like, the vapor is there. They're trying to give the spark, right?
Yes.
And going back to that boiling point, it would not be difficult to capitalize on all of that tension, all of that buildup to get to that boiling point, right? And then just push it over the edge.
Yep. And think if you are a foreign government that is interested in the degradation or destruction of the United States. Can you think of any foreign governments that might be interested in that? The government of Stolichnaya, perhaps? The government of... I'm not going to list them. You can use your imagination. There are countries around the world that don't particularly love the United States, right?
Weird.
And I don't know whether or not they're actively trying to get us to off each other in a civil war, but there are at least some indicators that people are trying to get us pissed off at each other, right? And we saw that with the how the 2016 election went, and how the election discussion is going right now in the United States. What I would offer is, if someone's trying to get you to stop believing in our electoral process, which is a peaceful revolution every 4 years where you can overthrow your government every 4 years without having to have a civil war, they probably don't have your best interest at heart. And if you're a gun guy and you're sure they're coming after your guns and you're going to go have the Boogaloo, let me tell you, the people trying to take your guns are way, way more scared of your money and your vote than your guns, right? They don't know anything about the AR-15. They don't know what the hell an AR-15 is. What they know is they disagree with you politically, and they don't want your votes and your voice. They want you out of the picture, right? So instead of taking up arms and talking about rioting and talking about, taking
Mole on my labia.
Yeah. Taking the gun from my cold dead hands or whatever, mole on labe. Instead, get out there and vote, and get out there and donate, get out there and lawfully protest, right? But no good will come from having a riot. No good will come from civil unrest. And by the way, the people who are trying to push you towards civil unrest, again, probably don't have your best interest at heart. In fact, they might be the freaking Russians. Not necessarily, but maybe.
Yeah. And they're also people that have like a really distorted sense of like how that's going to go for them, I think.
Yeah.
You know, and the point of this episode, and when we talk about like, you know, gun control comes up, or, you know, whatever it is that you're passionate about that like you're worried the government might infringe on. And I'm not saying that those aren't legitimate concerns. I'm just saying that people have this idea that like they're going to take matters into their own hands. And I want you to think about that monopoly on violence thing, because that's not to say that you can't like defend yourself, right? Like it's not, when the definition of a state to this monopoly on violence, the ability to use force on its residents, it's not to say that the government cannot authorize you to defend yourself against, you know, an intruder in your house or an attack or something like that, like whatever. But like you could probably handle that. But understand that like the government's job is to build a strong nation, like or a state or whatever. It's beyond just you. Like it's not just about you. And I feel like there are a lot of people. What?
And that was me gasping and clutching my pearls over the idea that the whole universe isn't centered around me. Right?
Yeah. Like it's not just about you. Like these I see these guys on the internets, and they're like, yeah, well, my guns are like, that's the most important thing in the world. And it's like, well, yeah, no, don't get me wrong. Like, I want you to keep your guns and I want my guns, and that's not the point. But the idea that like, that you're going to go like take up arms against the United States government or something, it's like, okay, well, sure, I guess that's your right in a sense. We're all about that. This nation was founded on that principle.
But let's not do that. If you can just vote, do that instead.
Yeah. But also but recognize too that there's a bigger picture that we, and not me, but like the government in general is in a sense protecting you from. Like building a strong nation involves having a society that operates in such a way that can work these things out, right? Like, I think this idea that we're going to go start the Boogaloo, like we're going to go like revolt against the government because we didn't get our way, in a sense, we have to be careful with that philosophy because of what Jim is saying, because there are people that want to capitalize on that sentiment.
Yes.
And like, is that really in our collective best interest? And I would argue probably not.
No. And it's the worst assumption you can make is assuming you would survive it.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's kind of where I'm going with that, right? Like that's the thing is like the government is not your worst enemy.
Yeah. So that leads us into kind of my next point is other examples of unrest, right? We started with the LA riots, which is kind of like a classical example of a major city riot. That is only one form of a breakdown in rule of law. There are lots, right? So we see civil unrest ranging from riots to full-on civil war all over history and all over the world. Some places get them more than others. Each one is worth studying. And I don't have time to deep dive each one, but some that you really should look into are the Arab Spring that just happened all across, most of the Arab world, especially North Africa. You should look at the Watts riots. You should look at the parallels between the Watts riots and the second Watts riots, the LA riots, right? And how similar they were.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Jim, and you beat me to it, but the Watts riots. So if you go to like the LA riots wiki page and you start reading through, and then you'll come across inevitably the Watts riots, and you click on that, it's like a 1960s version of almost exactly the same thing. Yeah, like there's some differences to it, obviously, but it's almost identical in the buildup and the overflowing of problems that led to the LA riots.
There's a saying, history doesn't repeat, but it does tend to rhyme. And there's definitely a rhyme there, right? You should look at the Ferguson protests, because the Ferguson protests in a lot of ways could have become the Ferguson riots, but didn't.
Yep.
And we want to understand
and why is that? I think
Yeah.
that's the important thing.
And it could be 10,000 different things. It could be which activists and which agitators showed up to the Ferguson protests. It might have been something as benign as like the temperature. Was it super cold or super hot out during Ferguson? I don't know, but that's the sort of thing that might drive a change in the group dynamic. It might be population density. That maybe you had a lot more density in South Central LA than you would have in Ferguson. It could be an appropriate law enforcement response. I mean, LE did things right and wrong in both cases, but maybe there was a change in how they responded. You should also look at the U.S. Civil War. You should also look at the American Revolutionary War. And also take a look at major civil wars around the world in the last 20 years. Look around Africa. Look at the civil wars in Iraq. And you can see the lethality that humans are capable of now is so different from 100 years ago. It's so different from 200 years ago or 250 years ago. And wow, we are good at killing each other. And
I'm mad at myself for even thinking about this, to be honest with you, because I hated it in like high school. But like the French Revolution, if you're just looking at the class war angle on things,
Yep.
the French Revolution is probably good. And I hated I hate like A Tale of Two Cities.
I hated that book so bad.
I can't even with that book. Like I can't even.
So
right?
at the
But,
high
like,
school that both Mike and I went to, the English teachers at the high school who might be listening, because I'm friends with some of them, they loved the book A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. It's a horrible book. Don't read it.
Here and here's the thing. Like I had to read that book
3 times.
So,
I had to do it 3 times.
Yeah, but the first one was between 8th grade. Like, I had homework over summer between 8th grade and my freshman year of high school, and I had to read that book. It didn't go well. It didn't go well at all. I hated it. But thinking back to it and thinking about the classes, like, I think it's relevant. And it is something at least to like read the Wikipedia page on.
I think that everyone getting their heads chopped off by a guillotine is the really relevant part of that, right? Like the mass murder that goes with mass civil unrest is what I really want everyone to kind of get out of this, right?
And
is
the
when
monopoly
you get
on violence
past
from
a
a nation
protest,
state.
past a riot, when you get the breakdown in monopoly on violence, that mass murder thing, when you get ethnic cleansing, that's really, really bad. There's no other way to put it. It's really bad and you don't want anything to do with it. Okay. So we want to understand them. We want to understand the whole spectrum of unrest. And we understand that certain factors will make them more likely or more severe. So today, we in my area, we had a tornado watch, which meant that conditions were favorable for a tornado, which meant everyone needed to kind of wake up and think about like, okay, well, there's convective activity in the area and there might be tornadoes. That's different from a tornado warning, right? Which is a radar or a human has seen a tornado. So I want you to think about what conditions are favorable for a human tornado, for this mass civil unrest, for the mass murder, mass violence kinds of things. Well, the first thing is major ethnic, religious, or class tension, right? When you get this big divide between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, when you have a big divide between whites and blacks, or between Latinos and Asians, or whatever groups, Hutus and Tutsis in Africa, whatever. When you have that tension building, that's a conditions favorable. When you have badly drawn borders, anywhere in the world you have badly drawn borders, you've got a conditions favorable.
People are going to fight over it.
Yep. When I talk about that severe gap between the rich and the poor, one of the things that I want you to keep an eye out for is what's called the desperation economy. Desperation economy is where people are doing literally anything to get by. Right? When they're literally selling their own daughters for food. When they are killing people for food. that desperation economy is a big glaring indicator that things are about to get really ugly really fast, right? And then endemic crime, where you see that crime hit like a critical mass of there are murders happening every day and no one's stopping them and no one's arresting them and they're just getting away with it, right? When you see that endemic lawlessness, that's conditions favorable. And then the triggers, the things that'll actually set it off, and I'd compare that to a tornado warning, right? Where you need to actually wake up and, I don't want to say freak out, but you need to stay alert to these. Anything that is described by media as a massacre should stand out to you. An unanswered crime. For example, the narrative that the police are getting away with X, right? Just like the Rodney King beating, right? An assassination will tend to set off riots. Someone getting away with murder, someone getting away with a rape can set it off, or especially a mass rape. And famine in general is also one of those, like, when it gets to the point people are literally starving, that's where you can expect to see things get really third world really fast, right?
Yeah, we did an episode on Maslow's hierarchy that talks about human needs and motivation, and it addresses that sort of thing.
Yep. So I want you to think about those things, and I want you to think about what makes conditions favorable, and that should drive your risk management assessment of riots and civil unrest, right? Right now, I think the United States is perfectly fine. I don't think we're going to get into a big civil war anytime soon, because we have a functioning political establishment, because we have a functioning government and electoral system, right? That doesn't mean it's always going to be that way. Things will change that calculus. So how do you prepare for mass civil unrest? If you're law enforcement, you need to, one, keep an eye out for those triggers. And you need to keep an eye out for those conditions favorable and try and nip them in the bud. And two, I need you to have a riot plan. And Mike can talk about counter riot tactics and stuff. I don't know that we have time for it on this episode, but I need you to think about it. I need that to be part of your, like, typical law enforcement planning is, what do we do when there's a riot?
And I'll throw this, Jim, because I mentioned this in the beginning, that we can do an entire episode on like some of the tactical stuff related to riots and crowd control. But I do want to throw this at you from like the groupthink perspective, and from the role in government stuff that we've talked about. One of the things that we've probably gotten right, and it comes with a degree of acceptable risk, is we have gotten cops out into the crowd to intermingle with people and to have to humanize us a little bit, right? Because remember that I talked about the Stanford prison experiment, where you had like that context thing where people just have like this natural thing where they want to go against the man. And a lot of, in the context of some of the riot type stuff or crowd control stuff that I've been involved with, where it's like a basketball game, people are like having a good time, they're drinking, right? And the cops are there trying to like enforce some rules, and people want to like kind of rebel against that a little bit for no good reason, maybe showing off for their friends or something like that. And it's kind of just a big F you to the man. And by intermingling with the crowd and building a rapport with them, it's gone, that helps a lot. So
you're no longer the man, you're that guy who gave me a high five, right?
You're Officer Mike, and he's kind of cool. Like, he's funny, and like we'll listen to him because we like him. And so like that strategic corporal thing really becomes a factor, I think, and it's something that we've probably gotten right. I mean, there's there's really important caveats there, because if things go sideways, then now you're in trouble because you've got like an officer in the crowd.
You're surrounded and cut off.
Yeah. So in terms of like riot and crowd control tactics, there's a broader thing that I think you need to consider that we've touched on a lot in this episode, and that is the context stuff, the groupthink stuff, and that building tension, right? Like you could probably diffuse that early on with any given interaction, and that goes a long way. So I would throw that out there for the purposes of this episode and tactics. That's what I got for you.
Yeah. On the civilian side, for personal defense, how do you prepare for a riot? I would offer that you are outnumbered, so don't. Get out of the kill zone. Get out of the hot zone. Wherever the
Off the X.
Yeah. So wherever the hot spots are, stay the hell away from the hot spots. Don't go looking for trouble. Don't look for a fight. Don't try to set up your own Alamo. Because no matter how good you are, no matter how preppered you are, I said that way on purpose, not prepared, but preppered.
Thanks for clarifying. I might have made fun of you for that.
I understand, but like, you're outnumbered, right? So you might get some of them, but eventually they're going to get you, especially if this turns into one of those big mass violence events, right? So the best thing you can do is vacate. Freaking just don't be there. Get away from the big crowd. Don't hang out around big protests. That's not a safe place to be, generally speaking. A little history lesson. Have you ever heard about being read the Riot Act?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. She read me the Riot Act, right? Do you know what that's from?
Nope.
Well, you're going to learn today. So, my understanding, and we'll probably link to the Wikipedia article about it. If you pull up Riot Act in it, you'll see it. I think it was Britain, where there'd be riots, because that's what they did, hundreds of years ago. And the rule was some officer of the law had to read the Riot Act before they were allowed to fire into the crowd. So he'd get up on a stage or up on a horse, whatever, and citizens.
That's kind of still a thing.
Citizens, per the Riot Act of 1873, you must disperse, by lawful order of the king. Okay, well, you're not listening, so give them a whiff of grape shot from the cannons, right? And related,
still a thing.
Yeah. So related to that, Napoleon
dispersal order.
Yeah, Napoleon, French, not British. His favorite riot control agent was his beginning in the military was artillery. His riot control agent was grape shot, was like a shotgun shell fired out of a cannon. That was give them a whiff of grape. That was a thing he'd tell his troops. So what I want you to understand about this and where are we going? I want you to understand that rule of law is really damn important and that we need to do everything we can to preserve and protect it. That's true on the law enforcement side. You are, if you have ever claimed the thin blue line, if you've ever worn that on a t-shirt, if you've ever had that on your wedding band, if you've ever had that as a tattoo around your neck, the thin blue line, this is the part you need to live up to, right? Is you are the representation of the rule of law. You are the legitimacy, and you need to uphold the legitimacy of the rule of law, which means that if someone pisses you off, you don't just wallop them over the head, right? You have to be the guy who maintains the credibility and legitimacy of the law, because you are where most people ever interact with the law is the cops, right? You are where the rubber meets the road, or where the boot meets the head, or whatever it is, right?
You are the balance.
Yeah. On the civilian side, don't be in a hurry to see the big Boogaloo. Don't be in a hurry to see that day come, right? I'm a gun guy. I'm a hardcore, pro-gun, whatever. And I believe that one of the reasons why we keep and maintain the right to bear arms is to be an insurance policy on the rule of law. But that doesn't mean I want to see it end. That doesn't mean that I want to see us overthrow the government. I don't. You have the opportunity to overthrow the government every 4 years, right? You go to the ballot box and you can fire that guy or that gal. So do that instead. As far as preparing for a riot, the way you prepare for it is you keep your eyeballs up and you look for those conditions favorable. And you do something about it early. If you see the tension rising, do something to try to lower the tension or move away from where the tension is. Because real mass violence, when it gets bigger than a local city riot, when it gets to nationwide, all it is deadly. And the assumption you're going to live through it it's a stretch. So, on that happy note, I think we owe a shout out to our sponsors.
Yeah, we do. Please take a second to go thank Ride-On Optics for sponsoring the show. Ride-On is bringing you high-quality glass from Japan with a lifetime warranty. Ride-On is all about interacting with people and customer service. So if you're in the market, go give them a call, and they will help you find what you need. You can find them at rideonoptics.com. RITON optics.com. Also by Mantis. Mantis is a firearms training tool that works in both live fire and dry fire. They've got some data from 10 million shots that they looked at that suggests that if you get about 1,000 rounds of dry fire with good feedback, you should see a noticeable difference in your performance. You can go check them out at mantisx.com for data-driven performance. If you want to ask us a question or give us feedback, head over to tactangents.com and click on the microphone. You can leave us a message. If it's good, we'll feature it on the show. If you want to support the show, you can give us $1 at patreon.com. That money's going to go right back into bringing you good content. You can also find us on social media. We are at TacTangents. And if t-shirts or stickers are your thing, you can find those on our website. Make sure you subscribe to the show for new episodes on the 1st and the 15th of each month. And that's all I got. Jim, anything else?
That's all I got. Be safe out there and do something to strengthen the rule of law. It's a good
Boogaloo.
thing. No Boogaloo. No.
All right. That's
Thanks.
all we got.
Cheers.
Good talk.